Well, after what was a cracking opening panel this morning, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our second keynote of this fantastic conference. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce somebody that I've worked with as the director of the Irish Museums Association over the past few years. Dr. Audrey, Whitty, who is now the chairman of the Irish Museums Association. And is doing an incredible job in terms of promoting and building that sector across Ireland and beyond. Audrey has been a great friend to us here in the Centre for Public History at Queen's in her capacity as Deputy Director and Head of Collections and Learning of the National Museum of Ireland, where again, she is doing an incredible job. Dr. Whitty is responsible for the care and interpretation of 5 million objects across the NMI sites, the 4 curatorial divisions: conservation, registration, education, photography, design and exhibitions, so no small feat. She was previously keeper of the Art and Industrial Division and has project managed and curated several exhibitions, including the acclaimed Proclaiming a Republic, the 1916 Rising, and a Dubliners collection of Asian art, the Albert Bender exhibition. She's a former curator of European and Asian glass at the Cumming Museum of Glass in New York, and in 2010 was conferred a doctorate from Trinity College Dublin as a result of her thesis, Albert Bender, Donations of Far Eastern Art to the National Museum of Ireland, in the context of his cultural interests in Ireland and California. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Audrey Whitty to give her paper entitled, here we go, looking for it, Asian Collections at the National Museum of Ireland. Audrey, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First and foremost, for the wonderful invitation to Bryony and Dominic and Emma, and just to congratulate you on what has already been an incredibly thought-provoking and wonderful morning. So hopefully I can keep it up, as they say, or fail dismally, one or the other. But I just wanted to do a synopsis first and foremost on the history of collecting of Asian material culture, and just to stress that when the National Museum of Ireland, we were in the middle of really looking at major strategic planning in the area of world cultures. We've just gone out this week with an advertisement for an ethnographer or world cultures curator, which is the first time either pre or post-Irish independence that has actually occurred since we were founded in 1877. So the resource issue alone is enormous, and it will be no small feat in which to do this correctly. The ethnographical amount to about 15,500 objects, and the Asian about 7,000. And I think both have to go hand in hand and cannot be seen exclusively from the other in terms of decolonisation policies in the future. So I'm just going to quickly give a synopsis, first and foremost, as to where we have got from, I suppose, 1877 to today. So the Science and Art Museum Dublin, now the National Museum of Ireland, was actually founded in 1877 under the Science and Art Museum Act. And officials for the museum began collecting based on the South Kensington model, which they were tied to administratively. And as with other large metropolitan centres of these islands where museums under the Science and Art Department existed, such as Edinburgh and Liverpool, policy dictated that the acquisition of applied or industrial arts be internationally as well as nationally based. And therefore, many objects of non-Western provenance, in the National Museum of Ireland's case, approximately 7,000 objects of Asian origin, came under the museum control. Much has been made of the great exhibitions of the 19th and early 20th centuries having played a leading role in this regard, and the registration and archives of the National Museum of Ireland for the years 1877 to 1948 confirm Asian material having been accessioned from such sources. Yet there is a marked decrease in the rate of acquisition of Asian applied arts and design after Irish independence in 1922, when the collections policy turned almost exclusively to the collecting of Irish manufacture, provenance and association. Also of significance in the archival information on acquisitions is the high instance of direct auction purchase. And for instance, during the years 1877 to 1889 alone, auction houses or dealers in Dublin, Cork, London, Paris, Rotterdam, Glasgow and Munich are repeatedly mentioned. Another category, which leads me to this subject in a few moments, is that of donation from wealthy and well-travelled Irish citizens who may have been buoyed up by the prospects of supporting their new cultural institution in Dublin in days prior to physical independence. With the amalgamation of the Royal Irish Academy's collection of Irish antiquities from 1890, the emphasis of the NMI's collections policy did begin to change course. An examination of the register entries for 1877 to 1889 reveals a so-called Anglo-Irish association with regards to some of these donors, many of whom having formed part of the military abroad. For example, the Burmese expedition of the 1880s, which leads me to this. By the term Asian material culture in the Art and Industrial Division of the National Museum, which is the Decorative Arts and History branch now based at Collins Barracks, the countries referred to include China, Japan, Tibet, Korea, India, Burma, Iran, Iraq and Pakistan, areas pertaining to the Asian continent generally, whether Middle Eastern, Indian subcontinental or East Asian, and not including Islamic material from Turkey and North Africa. Asian world cultures material resides in the Irish Antiquities Division of the National Museum. Although significant amounts of ethnography from the Pacific Islands, Indian subcontinent, Australia, New Zealand, Africa and North America were originally accessioned under the auspices of the Art and Industrial Division, not the least of which came from the University of Dublin, for example, the Cook Voyages, these collections have since been transferred to the Irish Antiquities Division, but they were originally accessioned in a very different format. An additional category is duplicate material received from the parent Science and Art Department of South Kensington. In many instances, there exists correspondence and or registration entries that confirm the transfer of Asian objects from London to Dublin to serve instructive purposes. Indeed, close links between the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin and the Dublin Science and Art Museum are very much underlined when reading through this same archival evidence. The fact the Metropolitan School and the museum were both situated on Leinster House lawn may have led to the impression of one of the latter's main remits, education of the native artisan or industrial artist. There are also instances of donation by the trustees of the British Museum, the Civil Service Cooperation Society, and of course the University of Dublin. Now, in relation to the great international industrial exhibitions of the late 19th century, the following examples in particular are worthy of note. Japanese material was purchased heavily at the Exposition Universelle of 1878, and the commercial agents of Fukakama and Shozen are specifically mentioned. In addition, purchases were also made of Indian and Persian objects from the British Indian section of the same exhibition via the incredible Caspar Purdon Clark, who had a very, a renowned career, became director of the V&A and then later the Metropolitan in New York. Purchases were also made from the Chinese Commission in Paris. And other exhibitions referred to in the register, which have yet to be thoroughly examined in terms of each individual artefact provenance, is the International Exhibition of Calcutta in 1883, the Colonial and Indian Exhibition of London of 1886, and the Royal Jubilee Exhibition Manchester of 1887. As with all great exhibitions of industrial arts during the latter half of the 19th century, beginning with the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations in London in 1851, emphasis was placed on those non-Western arts which successfully adhered to traditional methods, in contrast to the fast pace of mechanisation considered by some scholars detrimental to creative fervour. And in Birdwood, C.M. Birdwood, Paris Universal Exhibition Handbook, he wrote the British Indian section to that particular exhibition. He even states his unease at certain aspects of the pottery produced by the Bombay School of Art that employed all the natives from Western India to imitate the hardware jugs of Mr. Stolton. This rather defensive opinion was not uncommon amongst well-meaning British Victorian writers, politicising against what they interpreted as the corruption, basically, of the more beneficial aspects of their subject peasantry. The main reasoning behind the expense involved in 19th century public collecting by the colonial powers was the fostering of sound native European industrial design with influences from as wide a geographical range as possible. And this leads me to the wonderful reclining Buddha here from Burma. As noted above, one of the categories of acquisition of Asian art was donation from the Irish associated with British military expeditions, and at least two in particular out of the three case studies I'm going to present today certainly fall into this category. The British military expedition to Burma of 1885 to 1886 involved Irish personnel such as Colonel Sir Charles Fitzgerald, KCB. In January 1891, he lent some Burmese Buddhist statuary to the National Museum, or the Science and Art Museum Dublin as it was called then. One such example, this which is part of Loan 220, still part of the National Museum of Ireland collection, is a reclining Buddha statue of marble. It is in the Mandalay style of 1857 to 1886. The figure's drapery is painted gold. The statue represents Buddha in the last stages of dying, awaiting nirvana. In 2002, the statue was identified by myself thanks to Ito Eshiro, a professor in Iwate Prefectural University in Japan, and John Smurthwaite in the University of Leeds, who got in contact with me to have been mentioned. Basically, this was mentioned twice in James Joyce's Ulysses. And we were able, myself in particular, to identify it through the collection, but obviously looking at their leads in terms of which episodes in Ulysses in which it was described. In Ulysses, there are two references to the statue in the National Museum on Kildare Street, as it was then, way before any Collins Barracks or Turlock Park. In the Lotus Eaters episode, when inspired by a poster advertising tea, Leopold Bloom thinks of the Far East. Buddha, their god, lying on his side in the museum, taking it easy with hand under his cheek. And in the Penelope episode, Molly Bloom remarks on Leopold, breathing with his hand on his nose like that Indian god he took me to show one wet Sunday in the museum in Kildare Street, all yellow in a pinafore, lying on his side on his hand with his 10 toes sticking out. Joyce must have seen this Buddha on exhibition at the National Museum sometime after it came into the institution in 1891, but before he left Dublin in 1904. Now, who was Colonel Charles Fitzgerald, and what was he doing with this Buddha, and how did it end up in Dublin? Well, Colonel Charles Fitzgerald was born in 1840 and he died in 1912. His full name was Charles John Oswald Fitzgerald, who married Lady Alice Fitzgerald, sister of the 5th Duke of Leinster, Gerald Fitzgerald. And I am deeply indebted to the remarkable contemporary artist Sophia Rudy, who is a recent graduate in media of the National College of Art and Design only in 2021, for pointing me in the direction of the survival of the Charles Fitzgerald diary, thanks to her own research as an undergraduate from his Burmese campaign of 1886 to 1888. And I would urge you to look up her wonderful website called cabinetofstolencuriosities.com, in which you'll see all of those major scans from the Burmese campaign in particular, and some of them quite shocking, to say the least. But there's definitely, this is an absolute cut and dry case of loot. So the actual diary is in the University of Minnesota in the Ames Library Manuscript Collection. It covers the dates the 25th of September 1886 to the 4th of February 1888. The 3rd Hyderabad contingent under Colonel Fitzgerald arrived in Burma in the early part of October 1886 and commenced operations against the numerous dacoit bands, as they were called. The regiment was divided into 4 squadrons which operated all over the Shwebo and Yau districts and a portion of the Wonto state. The regiment served 14 months in Burma. The scrapbook includes press clippings, correspondence and photographs of Burma and covers the period from 1882 to 1892. The correspondence include Sir Charles Bernard Fitzgerald, Chief Commissioner for Burma, Colonel F.B. Middleton, Lieutenant Dick Wapshare of the 4th Cavalry, Lieutenant D.S. Buist of the 2nd Infantry Hyderabad Contingent, T.J. Burnett of the Bombay Gazette, and E.I. Wright of the 2nd Cavalry. Included is General White's speech to the 2nd Squadron, 3rd Cavalry, that took place at Mandalay on the 24th of October 1886. Middleton's letter includes a list of prisoners in his camp and a list of arms captured. The 30 photographs include scenes of Shwebo and Mandalay and numerous photographs of King Thibaw and his palace. So I'm just going to try and... So this is the registration entry, or what I should say, loan, because it's still a loan from 1891. It's a very interesting situation because a part of it was handed back 2 years later in 1893, and I'll get into that now further. But I always think there is nothing like the original archival description. There is nothing like the original transfer of title in terms of the letters exchanged between either the recipient in the museum or indeed the donor, in inverted commas. So I'll get to that now shortly. But just to put you in your mind's eye that this is the list that was there later inserted, whereby it became loans 220, 221 and 222. It was a huge amount of booty, is the only way to put it. And I'll get on to this now in a moment, but I just wanted to show you a few more to kind of put it more in context. A first mention of this loan collection of extensive material from Colonel Charles Fitzgerald to the Science and Art Museum Dublin comes via Fitzgerald's brother-in-law, Gerald, Duke of Leinster, on the 16th of September 1890. When the Duke writes to Thomas Henry Longfield, Keeper of the Art and Industrial Division, that his brother-in-law, Colonel Charles Fitzgerald, has some Burmese spoils, pagodas, umbrellas, sacred writings, idols, and would be happy to loan them to the museum if you have space for them. Is there a chance of this? Yours faithfully, Leinster. This is followed by a letter from Colonel Charles Fitzgerald to the museum on the 11th of January 1891, in which he outlines his appointed London-based transport agent, Alexander Fletcher of Bishopsgate, who was working on inventorying the contents of each case. So each case implies the sheer volume of material here. On the 23rd of January 1891, the collection arrives at the museum. And basically showing now the original loan listing. When some were returned on the 8th of May 1893, carriage paid insured for £100 and addressed to Colonel Charles Fitzgerald at Dunsmore, Carlisle Road, Eastbourne. 2 bronze idols were returned. Just bear with me for a moment. There's also 1 gong, 9 treasures of wood, 2 idols, 1 umbrella, 4 handles for umbrellas, 2 swords, 4 holy books, 1 idol seated, 2 trays, 2 vases, 1 cover for the vase, and 1 idol of marble. But the rest remained, and I'll go into more detail about that later. But it just shows you the sheer extent of it. So by far the most important letter to have survived in the archives of the Art and Industrial Division concerning this loan was written by Colonel Charles to T.H. Longfield on the 8th of November 1891. In which he acknowledges his last of Longfield's letter to him, dated the 25th of April. Fitzgerald appears to be answering a series of questions posed by Longfield as to the provenance of each of the pieces in the collection. So the letter continues. The age of the temple or shrine of which, and I'm sorry, some of his writing is practically illegible, was carved, were taken is important. I have no record of finding exactly the age. The Buddha's temple, gongs on which are all with you, were collected by me in Shweto and Yeu districts of Upper Burma. These districts, most easterly districts in Upper Burma, lie between the river Irrawaddy in the east and the river Shinwen in the west. From north to south, they're surrounded by the river Mon. My regiment stationed these 2 districts for some 18 months during the era Pachonda in bringing with me all articles of particular note, some of them from being printed up. So I think he was trying to write something about his regiment's activities by making that statement. I wrote about the Hyderabad, but have not received an answer. I'll write again. I am thinking of disposing of all or some Burmese curios to the Chicago exhibition if they will take them. Perhaps you can kindly tell me to whom I should write and what you consider the value of the larger temple, articles, etc. With kind regards, yours truly, Colonel Charles Fitzgerald. So what's remarkable about this letter is the fact that he makes a map to show exactly where he took the material. Now, it's probably not particularly well looked at there, but it certainly deserves a much closer scrutiny, and preferably by people who know the area in question. But it certainly is a huge lead in an archive that you don't come across every week in terms of actual geographical positioning of where certain troops went in and where they raided material from. So to me, it's an absolutely significantly important letter, and something that we only realised from my own research in January that even existed in the archive. So the importance of going back over everything again and again and again, it just cannot be stressed enough when it comes to provenance research. By the 12th of November 1891, the London office of the World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago 1893, was in contact with T.H. Longfield after Charles Fitzgerald's, suggestion that they might go to Chicago in 2 years' time. I write to ask if you would be so good as to send me a detailed list of certain Burmese curios belonging to him, which he is anxious to dispose of, and which are now exhibited in the Science and Art Museum at Dublin. Yours faithfully. There therefore came about a split in the collection, and those that remain include the following. So I'm just going to go through some of them if that's okay. But just before I do, this is one of those scans from Charles Fitzgerald's library in the Ames Manuscript Library collection of the University of Minnesota. And what's, leaves a bitter aftertaste is how he describes people. So a group of Burmese friends that is probably one of the most ethical ones I could show you today, but it's certainly worth going into the Cabinet of Stolen Curiosities website by Sophia Rudy and looking through the others that she has very beautifully put up. So just to give you, I suppose, a bit of a spotlight on what we still have in the collection that didn't return in May of 1893. So we have this incredible seated Buddha, marble with a cobra headdress. We have this small giltwood seated Buddha, referred to as a wood idol, and it's loan number 221, so it wasn't the initial loan of 220. We have these small carved figures of a man and a woman that are absolutely beautiful, and very much in miniature, but absolutely stunningly carved. 2 of 4 carved animal figures, possibly tigers. Again, all of these are Burmese. Carved wooden figure of a tiger standing on a branch, one of at least 2 in the collection. A flat bell from Burma of brass, and it has a beautifully engraved peacock on it. And then we have an incredible treasure trove that nobody has ever investigated, that again, in terms of interfaith dialogue and repatriation requests for the future, is something that would again be an absolute no-brainer in terms of return. And these are particularly important Holy Scripture books. We have at least 2 of them. All of these leaves are between boards, and they came in with loan 221. This is one other example of one of the holy books. We also have a standing Buddha, gilt wood, carved and gilt, but inset with glass, white mica and green mica. And its accompanying figure of a standing upright Buddha is actually in the Chester Beatty Library on loan from the National Museum of Ireland since the year 2000, and it is part of the same job lot of Colonel Charles Fitzgerald on his lute. We also have another miniature reclining figure of a Buddha, in addition to the large one I would have started with at the beginning of the lecture. So it's an incredibly complex situation, I suppose, in terms of the fact that we would need to find out exactly whereabouts the loot took place. At least the letter is a huge lead. His diaries are a massive lead, but it would be something I think that would be relatively straightforward in terms of ethically and morally the right thing to do if such a request was forthcoming. So I'm going to go on to another example, the second case study now. And in terms of Tibetan material, the most important acquisitions prior to the Albert Bender collection of the 1930s that came in involve approximately 41 objects of metalwork from Lhasa. They are inscribed in the Art and Industrial Division's Register for 1904 with the following information: collection of metalwork vessels brought from Lhasa, Tibet, £100. In the archives, the information provided is not much more revealing. At least I thought that, and I'll tell you now that I was so wrong. From a statement regarding this Tibetan collection of work from Lhasa being offered for sale. Equivalent collections are found in the National Museums Liverpool and the Victoria and Albert Museum collections, but their Tibetan material was accessioned the following year in 1905. Therefore, the acquisition of a Tibetan collection by the National Museum in the year of the expedition itself, of Young Husband's expedition, is of huge significance and illustrates the volume of Irish personnel that were actually involved. The fact that Captain Frederick O'Connor, an Irishman, was responsible, due to his linguistic ability, for drawing up the terms of the Treaty of Lhasa also illustrates the central involvement by Irish military. The majority of the metalwork is very religious in associations such as butter lamps and flageolet instruments. The purchase price of £100 was a substantial amount of money for acquisition by the museum at that time, and reinforces the impression that Ireland's National Museum was just as interested in this newly opened territory as Sven Hedden and Gosta Montel in Sweden and the Victoria and Albert Museum in Britain a year later. Yet, on investigation and through examination of the objects themselves, it appears that this collection of metalwork was under the care of the Science and Art Museum 4 years earlier, as early as 1900, on loan, yet another loan that was subsequently donated in 1904 from a very interesting character called Major G. Shenovic's Trench. On examination of this object, 1904.379 is the registration number, this wonderful, beautiful Tibetan teapot. Underneath was the most incredible clue. Very rarely you come across these sort of clues, but when you get them, you make sure you lead on them. Because underneath it is the loan sticker referring to a loan number. Loan number 380, number 17, no less, confirms that this collecting of Tibetan material culture dates 4 years prior to the Young Husband expedition, to the year of 1900. Who was G. Shenovic's Trench? It seems his dates are 1859 to 1937. He was born George Frederick Chenevix Trench in Bittern, Hampshire on the 23rd of June 1859 to Philip Charles Chenevix Trench and Ellen Maria Turner. He attained the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Chenevix Trench writes to the Science and Art Museum Dublin in 1900 stating that he has a collection of Lassa work, which at present is with Shout, the silversmith in Albertgate. This is J.T. Shout of Albertgate, southwest London, a very, very renowned silversmith of the day. He goes on to make the statement that I am such a wanderer in Asia. He also mentions Lord Curzon in attempting to explain where the collection came to be attained. I am completely in such a corner of Persia unknown to the world, until Viceroy Lord Curzon wrote up the place in his books on Persia and attracted the attention of not only our own, but also that of Russia to this important geographical position which Sistan refers to in terms of India and Shirat and luscious road to the sea. I am found by a Russian beginning to struggle to the absorption of the unity within this sphere. It is not a choice. I am truth alone and in my tent. I am only a reporter here too, and I've seen all to be seen suggested plans to make our own formidable rival in Persia. He signs it Major G. Chenevix Trench, HRM, Consul General Murshidabad, Persia. Did he travel to Tibet? Perhaps not. But Chenevix Trench was part of a Central Asian trade network or route. In Thomas Halditch and Captain Kenyon's Journey in Central Asia discussion, the Geographical Journal of 1900, I found mention of him. Major G. Chenevix Trench is thanked in remarks as being a member of the Council of the Royal Geographical Society. What is very interesting and indeed of huge dismay is the attitude, though, expressed by Halditch and Kenyon when they state in the same discussion on page 526, the generally hostile attitude of Tibetans to Europeans is entirely and orders of the Lassen priesthood, who fear for their supremacy if British influence were once felt in Tibet. No one has knowledge of this extraordinary organisation can doubt that this would be a result much to be desired in the interests of those crushed beneath the tyranny of the monasteries. Again, very much the outsider perspective, quite abhorrent to be honest, but it brings to mind that there is no such thing as a non-power dynamic when it comes to transactional trade exchange, when one views oneself as superior. And that's another thing we need to look at, that even if things aren't necessarily straightforward, loot, and therefore a cut and dry case of if a request comes in for repatriation, you do it correctly to the right community. There are also instances where it's far more nuanced, but still not what I would call morally sound or ethically sound, certainly by 21st century perspectives anyway. Chenevix Trench is also referenced in a journey from Quetta to Meshed via the Turkestan trade route by Earl of Ronaldsay and Edward Penton in the Geographical Journal of July 1902. 50 miles from Robat, we came to Gerdi Thena, a small post recently constructed under the direction of Major Chenevix Trench, at that time consul at Sistan. He further continues that when he reached Nasiratabad, the capital of Sistan, the whole face of the country changed these last 120 miles. Instead of a dry, waterless plain, it became a plain intersected with ditches and canals and covered with low scrub jungle and with pools of water, making travelling anything but pleasant, with the exception of one or two lately made by Major Trench, the recently appointed British consul for Sistan. There were no bridges, and the canals being often deep, wettings were unpleasantly frequent. Chenevix Trench was obviously resourceful and highly respected as an administrator of empire. Penton continues with an even greater reference to the building accomplished by Chenevix Trench. The consulate at Nasiratabad, Iran, or Persia, was founded in 1899 by Major Sykes, and the house was built by Colonel Trench during his stay of a year at Nasiratabad on his way to take up the consul generalship at Meshed, or Mashhad, as it is now in Iran. So I'm just going to show you some of the material now from this particular collection before I go on to the third and final case study, and then reference to post-independence at the end. This is an incredible flageolet that came in, basically, and it's a musical instrument basically of wood, and it's silver mounted with turquoise and lapis lazuli. It's a teapot, brass body, highly ornamented bands and medallions in copper and silver, and made in the form of a particular animal shape in terms of the spout and the handle. Another teapot, copper with applique silver repoussé ornamentation, absolutely stunning material. Incense burner, brass, pierced ornamentally on feet, and also there are dragon handles on either side at the bottom of the actual handle itself. Referred to in the register as a charm box, Copper repoussé front. Again, these are ridiculous descriptions. We had somebody from Tibet to look at these in particular. A lot of this could be completely rewritten and the original thrown out. Small sealed figure of a deity or saint in painted clay. This is a charm box, again, copper. On the front, a pierced and engraved brass plaque. A vase or bottle, cast brass with engraved ornament of boat-shaped body, birds' heads at the ends, which is a really stunning object. A small pagoda for ashes, so basically would have contained the ashes of somebody. Incense burner and cover with floral design, the body and 3 feet formed as elephant heads. I don't know whether you can see that, but they are really quite stunning, the elephant heads at the bottom. A prayer wheel, a silver cylinder, parcel gilt set with turquoises, silver mounted with a wood handle. Another prayer emblem, the dorje, brass thunderbolt form, very sacred in Tibetan Buddhism. The bell, light bronze with emblems and ornament and relief, and the handle in the form of half a dorje. Another beautiful prayer wheel, copper cylindrical box inlaid with silver and repoussé, and the cylinder containing the prayer is actuated by a shelf running through a hole in the lid. So I'm going to get on to the final one in terms of, I suppose, the 1890s in particular. It's another remarkable collection acquired by the Science and Art Museum Dublin during the 1890s, 1897 to be particular, and is referred to in the register as the illustrated catalogue of the treasures of the Wan Ming Wan, the Summer Palace at Beijing. And I so apologise for my pronunciation of Mandarin going forward, so I certainly will try my best. As accurately described by Beth McKillop, former Director of Collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the UK and Irish holdings of the Hung Chau Liki Tushi illustrations of imperial ritual paraphernalia, to give it its proper name, may originate in the Wen Yong Ye library copy, which was held at the Old Summer Palace, the Wan Ming Wan, and sacked by Anglo-French forces in 1860. There are four holdings in total. The Victoria and Albert Museum acquired 290 folios in 1895, 72 in 1900, 34 in 1904, and about 128 in 1953. The British Library acquired about 31, National Museum Scotland acquired 65, and the National Museum of Ireland acquired technically 61, but in reality, when you count them, 54. The original work was compiled between about 1750 and 1759 and revised in 1767. It depicts objects that embody concepts of rule, visualization of ritual, precedence and hierarchy at the Chinese imperial court. The HCL QTS, or Hung Chau Liki Tushi, can be seen as the conclusion of the Qianlong Emperor's efforts to regulate ritual codes and procedures. 27 court painters and calligraphers contributed to its composition. The complete work is actually in 18 physical parts and is divided into 6 sections. Sacrificial tools, ceremonial robes, musical instruments, insignia, military objects. A printed version actually does exist and is available in the 1963 Taipei Sikuquanju reprint, and complete sets of the manuscript version with colour illustration are held by the Palace Museum Beijing and by the National Museum of China. Previous research on the Hung Chau Liki Tushi has been published by Margaret Medley in 1959 and Ming Wilson in 2004. Ming in particular, Ming Wilson's work is absolutely astounding, and we worked together to look at our pages at the time. And they're all published through the Transactions of the Oriental Ceramic Society. According to Ming Wilson, the original 1895 Victoria and Albert Museum purchase was for the sum of £200. And I quote, "These illustrations depict dragon robes and other articles related to the imperial household. Several seal paper on the end papers, including the Wan Ming Wan, the Hall of 5 Happiness and 5 Generations, and the seal used by the Qianlong Emperor when he reached the age of 80. A smaller oval seal of Qianlong's can also be found in some of the illustrations. Based on this evidence, the manuscripts were accessioned under the heading, the Imperial Wardrobe." So I went looking with that particular clue, and I'll show you what we found. In the same year, the V&A decided to send what it thought to be duplicates to the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh, now the National Museums of Scotland, and the Dublin Museum of Science and Art, now the National Museum of Ireland. And as Ming says, these are not duplicates. Every single folio was individually different, and they made, I suppose, quite a mistake in splitting it up, thinking that they had 2 or 3 of the same type. In reality, everything was incredibly individual and unique. So again, thanks to Ming Wilson and Beth McKillop, and as already mentioned, the main body of the commission of the Hung Chau Liki Tushi began in 1750 and was completed in 1759. As many as 27 court painters and calligraphers were working on the commission under 5 editors-in-chief, chiefs Shilu, Zhang Pu, Wang Yudun, Gong Bao, and Ye Guzong. After editing and further expansion in the ensuing years, the manuscript was printed by the Palace Publications Office in Wu Ying Palace in 1766, and it was finally included as part of the Four Treasures Imperial Library project in 1773. This is an absolute treasure trove in terms of how important this is to China. For that purpose, 7 versions in total were produced and stored in libraries across the Chinese Empire. The V&A Museum's collection of the manuscript is incomplete. All its leaves, together with those in the V&A itself, the British Library, the National Museum of Ireland and National Museums of Scotland, may have been part of the version kept in the Wangyang Pavilion Library in the Wang Mingwan Summer Palace in Beijing. The National Museum of Ireland pages belong to those leaves from this same manuscript acquired by the V&A Museum from a certain Walter H. Harris, the son of a builder, a director of Schweppes in 1895, but they were only transferred to Dublin in 1897. In the letter files of the Art and Industrial Division archive, there exists a memo from the 4th of November 1896 in which the financial estimates for the following year are discussed. Amongst the objects requested for purchase in 1897 is a reference to drawings of Chinese imperial wardrobe. So that's how I was able to track it in January, with a handwritten £200 written overhead. According to the 1897 register, however, 61 drawings were purchased for £50 by the Science and Art Museum, Dublin. In reality, there are 54, and in 2018, the paper conservator Susan Corr was contracted by the National Museum of Ireland to examine the condition and treatment of these folios and consolidate where necessary. The illustrations are painted directly on a cream yellow silk, which is laminated to a multi-layered substrate of papers to form the equivalent of a lightweight board. This gave the opportunity for me to go back on what I had done with Beth McKillop and Ming Wilson and re-examine the reverse of each folio or page, and one that very much stood out was this particular one here. It's number 46 of the year 1897. It's described as dragon robe worn by the imperial concubines of the first rank, back view, but on its reverse, you can barely make it out there, towards the bottom left-hand side is a massive clue. It's a handwritten name, Captain Upperton. After some research, I can definitely state that one John Upperton, later Major General, was stationed in China during the period 1857 to 1860. Therefore, it is very conceivable that John Upperton was part of the Anglo-French sacking of the Old Summer Palace in 1860. But who was he? According to Dix, Noonan Webb auction house or dealers in Mayfair in London, which sold Upperton's medals in 2004, John Upperton was the son of Robert Upperton of Lansdowne Place, Brighton, and was born on the 10th of June 1836. He was nominated for the Bengal Army by D.C. Marjoribanks Esquire on the recommendation of the Marquess of Bristol. He saw action in India, China, Bengal, Baluchistan, Afghanistan, Oudh, Lucknow, Egypt, and Sudan. According to Dixon, Noonan and Webb, in June 1859, Upperton was directed to do duty with the newly raised and most junior regiment of Bengal Cavalry, Fane's Horse, and accompanied it on the Anglo-French expedition to China as adjutant. He was present at the action of Sinho, the capture of the Taku forts, and the action of Shangka-Wan, on which occasion he was thanked for his services by General Montauban, the French commander-in-chief. After an illustrious career, he advanced to Major General in 1894. Upperton then returned to England upon retirement and took up residence at 7 Sloane Street, London, where he died aged 88 on the 2nd of July 1924. This trajectory coincides with a reference to John Upperton in the London Gazette of October 16, 1894, in which Major General John Upperton CB is amongst a group of officers transferred to the unemployed supernumerary list, dated 20th of September 1894, so his retirement date. So the existence of the HCLQTS folios in the collection of the National Museum of Ireland is a true legacy of empire, and the partial holdings of both the Irish and UK institutions form a valuable resource for historians of Shin court practice, dress and ritual. And back in 2017, efforts were being made by Beth McKillop and others to liaise with Professor Wang Yarong, Senior Textiles Researcher, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and advisor to the Capitol Museum in Beijing, to at least publish these European holdings. Only then can we go some way towards rectifying the taking of these world-important folios in the first place. So I'm just going to show you some of them. Just bear with me while I get my bearings. So this one, is the summer court robe worn by the emperor himself. It's the mourning cloak number 2, worn by the emperor, carefully designed according to the pattern of the present dynasty. It is made of purple sable skins and is in all other respects identical with the correct cloak made of black fox skins. Summer court robe worn by the emperor. Court necklace worn by the emperor, and in brackets, not a duplicate. Court necklace worn by the emperor, so the other one of 1 + 2. Court girdle number 1 worn by the emperor, again, not a duplicate. Drawing of a gong, which accompanies this, the song sung at the picking of the mulberry leaves. The flute, which accompanies the song sung at the picking of the mulberry leaves. The wonderful thing about the National Museum of Ireland holdings is that they have so many of the musical instruments. That's highly unusual with the UK equivalents. So they have become quite important for that reason. This is the sword worn by all ranks, from the baillet, which was the prince of the 5th rank, up to dukes. An ironing hook sword carried by the left wing of the vanguard. The golden coronet worn by the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. Court jacket worn by the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. Drawing number 3. For a description of this jacket, it says, see the description of the court jacket number 3 worn by the empress. So in other words, the concubines took their lead from whatever the empress was wearing. Court jacket worn by the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. Drawing number 3, back view. Winter coat, court robe worn by the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. Drawing number 1. Summer court robe worn by the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. Drawing number 1, back view. Summer court skirt worn by the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. And for a description, it says, see description of summer court skirt for the empress. Flag of a banner lieutenant of the artillery and musketry corps. Flag of a banner lieutenant of the artillery and musketry, but lieutenant of basically the same, it's basically 2 versions of the same flag for the artillery and musketry corps. Colonel's banner of the Rattan Shield Division. Another Colonel's banner of the Rattan Shield Division. Flag of the quartermasters of the Rattan Shield Division. And again, the Rattan Shield Division. Banner of generals commanding Manchu garrisons outside Peking, of lieutenant generals and of deputy lieutenant generals. And this is again banner of generals commanding Manchu forces outside Beijing. Directing flag used by governor generals and governors of provinces, by brigadiers of the Chinese forces. State flowery umbrella, black, borne by the guard before the imperial concubines of the 1st rank. Ornamental pheasant sedan chair of the guard of concubines of the 3rd rank. I'd love to see the one of the 1st rank. Washing basin borne by the guard of the imperial concubines of the 3rd rank. And then just to finish very, very briefly, I just wanted to do a quick synopsis of what happened post-independence when it came to the Albert Bender collection, in particular of Asian art, which is an anomaly in the history of Asian collecting by the National Museum. He approached the National Museum in December 1931. Albert Bender was born in 1866, the son of the chief rabbi of Dublin, Philip. Children, and when he was 13 he emigrated to San Francisco, where he amassed a fortune as an insurance broker. But his 3 main collecting interests were Asian art, rare printed books, and modern avant-garde art. He was a major patron in the early days of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, and a founder of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So I think a lot of modern art historians, modern art in itself, would be more aware of him than, let's say, his Asian collecting interests. But he is of huge importance to Ireland in how the government dealt with him in the 1930s, and how that may be seen as a precursor to how Chester Beatty was dealt with in the 1950s. But just to say that nothing is as straightforward as it might appear. So I would have thought, after doing a doctorate on him, that, this was pretty, there wasn't that many instances of, let's say, question marks over his collecting history. But I'm wrong. There is one particular question mark, and it's particularly associated with this object. And it's the head of a bodhisattva. It dates to late Ming dynasty, so around 1600 AD. And it is a remarkable object because it is evidence, I suppose, of looting in China itself prior to it going into the auspices of a dealer who then ends up taking it to San Francisco, and obviously it is then collected by Albert Bender. But the donation was made to the National Museum of Ireland of this head of a bodhisattva from circa 1600 on the 9th of May 1932. It consists of a bronze head from Shanxi province. And Hart, who was Bender's dealer, supplied the item and wrote to Adolph Marr, the then director of the National Museum of Ireland, on the 28th of March 1932. At the request of Mr. Albert M. Bender, 311 California Street, San Francisco, we have shipped by express today a bronze head which is to be placed in the museum as a gift from Mr. Bender. This head is to be placed with a set of Tibetan paintings which was sent to the museum by Mr. Bender some months ago. These are the Tanka paintings. The bronze head was found in a temple in a small town in Shanxi province when the temples were destroyed at the order of Feng Huishang in 1927 and brought to Peking. The head belonged to a statue, several of which stood on the altar of the temple. These statues, being too heavy for the soldiers to carry away as loot, had the heads knocked off and sold. This head represents one of the bodhisattvas. As you know, these are beings who are approaching Buddhahood but have not yet reached the supreme heights to pass into nirvana. The bronze head of this bodhisattva reached the British and Irish Steam Packet Company Limited at the North Wall in Dublin on the 27th of April 1932 and was officially acknowledged on the 9th of May. The artistic quality of this bodhisattva corresponds in date to an increasing complexity in Chinese society from the end of the 16th century, reflected in an enriched cultural life in which heterogeneous tastes supported a wide variety of artists and craftsmen. The presence of foreigners at court and increasing affluence, which made them merchants independent of the court and of the official class, were only two of the many factors which nurtured artistic diversity. So that's exactly what I wrote in my book of 2011, and also you can find a lot more about the Albert Bender donations in the PhD, which is online as well as the book. But just wanted to bring to a close the fact that not everything is clear-cut. Just because something suddenly changed course in terms of collections policy in the 1920s does not mean that you have a spot-white mantle thereafter when it comes to other unsolicited donations from world culture material coming into the National Museum of Ireland, and to be extremely honest and open about that. We are very much at the start of it. We have a lot of work to do and a lot of resources in which to make the case for increased funding. But I think we have the stomach and the heart in which to do it, because we know it'll be the right thing to do, full stop. So thank you for listening to me, and I really appreciate it very much. Thank you.